Welcome to Nightshift Horror. Before we check in tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now get comfortable. The Nightshift is about to begin.
Story 1. Initial Intake Statement. I was completing the risk assessment section when she answered the question I hadn't asked yet. Not the one I was about to ask, the one I would ask 3 questions later about childhood trauma. She gave me the exact answer I would type into the system 40 minutes from that moment, word for word, including the clinical terminology I habitually used, but patients never did. My name is Catherine Fowler, and I worked as a psychiatric intake nurse at Millbrook Behavioral Health Center for 11 years before I submitted my resignation. I'm providing this statement voluntarily, though I understand it may be used in the facility's internal review. I've been asked to describe the events surrounding patient file 04-117, admitted on November 7th of last year. I will do my best to remain factual. Intake assessments followed a standardized protocol. The process was designed to be predictable, both for the patient's comfort and for clinical consistency. I conducted these interviews in Room C, a small office off the main admission area with a desk, 2 chairs, and a panic button beneath the desk edge. The room had no windows. Fluorescent lighting hummed at a frequency I'd stopped noticing years ago. I kept a digital tablet for documentation, a printed intake form as backup, and a cup of coffee that went cold during every interview. The patient arrived at approximately 7:15 in the evening. I'll refer to her as Jane Doe, as her legal name is part of sealed records. She was a voluntary admission brought in by family members who did not stay for the interview. She appeared to be in her late 30s, casually dressed, cooperative, and oriented to person, place, and time. Her affect was flat but not inappropriate. She made adequate eye contact. There were no visible signs of intoxication or acute distress. I began with the standard introduction. I explained my role, the purpose of the assessment, the limits of confidentiality, and the approximate duration of the interview. She nodded at appropriate intervals. I documented her consent and started with demographic information. Name, date of birth, address, emergency contact. She provided each answer clearly and without hesitation. Her voice was steady, neither loud nor soft. I typed each response into the tablet as she spoke. Then I moved into the clinical assessment. I asked about her chief complaint, what brought her to seek treatment today. She described feelings of unreality that had persisted for several weeks. She said the world felt scripted, that conversations seemed rehearsed, that she knew what people would say before they spoke. I noted this as possible derealization. I asked follow-up questions about the onset, frequency, and triggers. She answered each one appropriately. I was midway through the mood assessment when it happened the first time. I stared at her. That wasn't an answer to my question. More importantly, it was an answer to a question I asked later in every intake, part of the trauma and developmental history section, which I wouldn't reach for at least another 20 minutes. I glanced down at my printed form to confirm. She blinked at me, looking momentarily confused. "Oh," she said, "my mistake." I made a note. Possible thought disorganization, jumping ahead in conversation. I repeated my original question about mood. She answered it appropriately this time. Some anxiety, mild depression, no significant irritability. I continued, but it happened again. I asked about sleep patterns. That was the answer to the suicidality question. Question 56. I hadn't even opened that section yet. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not confused this time, something closer to pity. "I'm answering the questions you're going to ask," she said quietly. A chill ran down my arms, the kind that has nothing to do with temperature, I glanced at the panic button beneath the desk, then back at her. She didn't appear threatening. She was sitting calmly, hands folded in her lap, waiting. "Let's stay focused on the present conversation," I said, using my de-escalation voice. "I asked about your sleep. 5 or 6, she said. Interrupted. I typed that in. Normal answer. I moved through the next several questions without incident. Appetite, energy level, concentration. She answered each one appropriately and in order. I started to relax. Maybe it was just a coincidence or a lucky guess based on standard assessment structure. Patients sometimes anticipated common questions. She smiled slightly. "I already told you." Word for word, exactly what she'd said 30 minutes earlier. I felt my pulse in my throat. I looked down at my tablet. I had typed her previous statement into the notes section as a documentation of her thought disorganization. But now, reviewing it, I saw that I had somehow placed it in the correct field, question 41, trauma history, even though she'd said it long before I'd asked the question. I scrolled up through my documentation. Everything was in order, answers aligned with questions. Timestamps progressed normally, but I had a visceral memory of typing her trauma response out of sequence, flagging it as confused speech. She asked. "No," I said automatically. I pushed through the rest of the assessment. I asked about substance use, medical history, previous psychiatric treatment, family history, current medications. She answered everything clearly and in sequence. No more jumps, no more premature responses. By the time I reached the final section, discharge planning and follow-up care, I had almost convinced myself I'd imagined the earlier discrepancies. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You're going to read this file again in 3 weeks. You'll notice things you don't remember writing. You'll check the timestamps and the edit history, but everything will appear normal. You'll wonder if you're losing time. You're not." My hands froze over the tablet. I asked. She stood up slowly. "Thank you for your time, Nurse Fowler. I should have asked more questions. I should have flagged her statement as delusional or hypervigilant. Instead, I walked her to the door and called for a psych tech to escort her to the inpatient unit. I returned to my desk and completed the assessment summary, selecting preliminary diagnoses from the drop-down menu. Unspecified anxiety disorder, unspecified depressive disorder, rule out dissociative disorder. I typed my clinical impressions, noted that further evaluation was needed, and submitted the file. Then I printed a hard copy for my personal records. I always did this with cases that unsettled me. I dated it, signed it, and placed it in my locked desk drawer. 3 weeks later, I was reviewing my active caseload when I came across file 04-117 again. I didn't remember why I'd flagged it for follow-up. I opened it and started reading. The demographic section looked normal, but when I reached the clinical assessment, I stopped. Question 19 asked about mood, but beneath it, in a smaller font, was a secondary note in brackets. Patient answered prematurely during question 9. I had no memory of writing that note. I scrolled down to question 41, trauma history. The answer was there exactly as I remembered, but again, there was a bracketed note. Patient provided this response during question 15. My chest tightened. I checked the edit history. The file showed only one entry, my original submission on November 7th at 8:32 p.m. No subsequent modifications, no revision log. I pulled the printed copy from my desk drawer. I unfolded it and compared it to the digital version. They were identical, including the bracketed notes, but I had printed this document immediately after submission, and I had no memory of typing those notes. I would never phrase documentation that way. I would flag disorganized speech in the clinical impressions section, not embed bracketed editorial comments in the answer fields themselves. I checked my other recent intakes. None of them had this formatting, just 04-117. I told myself I'd been tired. November 7th had been a long shift. I'd probably added the notes and forgotten. Stress, fatigue, standard memory fallibility. But her words circled back. You'll notice things you don't remember writing. I opened the file again 2 days later. This time there was a new section I didn't recognize. It was labeled Secondary Intake Addendum, dated November 7th at 9:04 p.m., 32 minutes after I'd submitted the file. The addendum contained additional questions I hadn't asked, questions about my own history. Interviewer notes. Do you recall completing intake assessments for patients who were not present in the room? Have you ever submitted documentation for conversations that occurred in reverse chronological order? And beneath those questions, answers. In my handwriting, my phrasing, yes, twice in the past month, I assumed I was conflating cases. I had never written those words. I had never been asked those questions. I checked the edit log again, still only one entry. November 7th, 8:32 p.m. My user ID, my credentials. I called ET. I explained that there appeared to be a documentation error in one of my files. Possible system glitch or corrupted data. They remote accessed my terminal and reviewed the file. They saw nothing unusual. They asked me to walk them through what I was seeing. I described the addendum section. There's no addendum in this file, the technician said. Just the standard intake form. I was looking at my screen. The addendum was right there halfway down the page in 12-point font, exactly where it had been. I asked. No, he said. There's no section with that label. Yes, I said. He did. I opened the screenshot. It showed the file exactly as I was viewing it on my own screen, including the addendum. I printed the screenshot. I printed my view of the file. They were identical. I asked the technician if anyone else had accessed the file. He checked. No other users, just me. Only my login, only my device. I thanked him and ended the call. That evening, I returned to my locked drawer and pulled out the original hard copy I'd printed on November 7th. I unfolded it carefully as if it might disintegrate. The addendum was there, on a document I'd printed 3 weeks ago, on a page that should not have existed when I fed the paper into the printer. I checked the signature line at the bottom of the intake form. My signature, my initials, the date, November 7th. But below that, in smaller print, there was now a second line, reviewed and confirmed by Catherine Fowler, RN. Date, November 28th, today's date. I had not signed this document today. I had not reviewed it today beyond pulling it from the drawer. I looked at the signature. It was mine. Same slant, same loop in the capital F, same pen pressure. I folded the document and locked it back in the drawer. I logged out of my terminal. I went home. That night, I dreamed I was conducting an intake assessment. The patient's face was obscured, blurred like a photograph taken through frosted glass. I asked the standard questions. The patient answered in my voice. When I looked down at the form, I saw that I was filling out both sides, asking and answering, interviewer and subject, documenting a conversation I was having with myself. I woke up at 3:14 a.m., the same time Jane Doe said she woke most nights. I returned to work the next morning and opened file 04-117 one final time. There was a new note in the clinical impressions section, appended beneath my original summary. Patient discharged November 29th per voluntary request, disposition, outpatient referral, follow-up scheduled with Nurse Fowler for continued assessment. November 29th was tomorrow. I had not scheduled a follow-up. We didn't do outpatient appointments. I worked inpatient intake only. I called the unit to ask about the patient's status. They had no record of anyone matching her description. They had no admission under file 04-117. They suggested I check with registration. Registration had no record either. I went to room C, the intake office, and checked my printed schedule from November 7th. Her name was not on it. I checked the sign-in log. No entry, but the file existed. The documentation existed. The printed copy existed. And the follow-up appointment was scheduled for tomorrow. I'm providing this statement because I don't know what else to do. I've reported the documentation discrepancies. I've requested a IT forensic review. I've submitted my resignation, effective in 2 weeks. Because I can no longer trust my own records. But I keep opening that file. And every time I do, there's something new. Another addendum. Another note I didn't write. Another question I didn't ask. Yesterday, the file included a section titled Intake Assessment, Catherine Fowler, RN. It was my intake, my history, my trauma responses, my sleep patterns, my suicidal ideation. I never answered those questions, but the handwriting was mine. I don't know if I'm documenting patients anymore or if I'm being documented. I don't know if Jane Doe was ever real or if she was just the first version of a question I'm not ready to answer. I don't know what happens during the interviews I don't remember conducting. What I know is this. Some files remain open long after the patient is gone. Some assessments continue without the assessor's knowledge. And sometimes the person being evaluated isn't the one sitting across the desk. They're the one holding the pen. Story 2. Observations during seclusion hours. I watched myself on the monitor, walking into room 11 for the 3rd time that shift. I was wearing the same scrubs, carrying the same clipboard, moving with the same deliberate pace I always use during seclusion checks. The timestamp read 0247. But I was standing in the observation booth at 0247, watching it happen. I hadn't left the booth in over an hour. My name is Marcus Aldridge, and I worked as a night shift psychiatric technician at Riverview Mental Health Institute for 9 years. I'm submitting this statement as part of the facility's incident review process. I have been asked to document everything I observed during my final month of employment, specifically regarding the seclusion observation protocols and the patient housed in room 11. I'll provide the details as accurately as I can. Night shifts in a psychiatric facility follow a particular rhythm. Checks every 15 minutes for patients in seclusion, documentation after each visual confirmation, medication passes at scheduled intervals, and crisis response when needed. Between those tasks, there's paperwork, charting, and the kind of stillness that only exists in institutional buildings after midnight. The fluorescent lights never dim, the air smells like disinfectant and the industrial detergent used on linens. Every sound carries. Footsteps on tile, the mechanical click of door locks, the occasional cry from a patient's room. I typically work the shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., paired with another psych tech named Leonard Hobbs. Leonard handled the West Wing. I covered the East Wing, which included the seclusion rooms. There were 4 seclusion rooms in my section, each equipped with a reinforced door, a camera mounted in the upper corner, and a small observation window made of impact-resistant glass. Patients were placed in seclusion only when they posed an immediate risk to themselves or others, and they were monitored constantly. Room 11 had been occupied for 6 days when the discrepancies began. The patient, I'll refer to him as John Doe per confidentiality protocols, was a 32-year-old male admitted on an involuntary hold after a psychotic episode. He'd been escalating on the main unit, responding to internal stimuli. speaking to entities no one else could see. After he attempted to harm another patient, the treatment team decided seclusion was necessary for everyone's safety. Standard procedure. I conducted the first check of my shift at 11:15 p.m. I approached room 11, looked through the observation window, and confirmed visual contact. John Doe was lying on the vinyl mattress facing the wall, breathing steadily. No acute distress. I documented the observation on my clipboard, patient resting quietly, no visible signs of agitation. I signed it, noted the time, and moved to the next room. 15 minutes later, I returned. 11:30, same observation, patient on mattress, calm, no changes. I documented it and continued my rounds. This continued through the first several hours of the shift. Every 15 minutes, I walked to room 11, looked through the window, confirmed the patient was stable, and documented it. The routine was so ingrained I could do it half asleep. By 2 a.m., I'd completed 8 checks, all unremarkable. At 2:15, I was sitting in the observation booth, a small room with monitors displaying live feeds from all the seclusion room cameras, when I noticed something odd. I was reviewing the footage from room 11, just a routine glance to confirm the camera angle was clear. The patient was still lying on the mattress. But in the corner of the frame, I saw movement. I leaned closer to the monitor. The movement resolved into a figure. Someone had entered the room. The door was still closed. I could see it in the frame, but someone was standing just inside, near the foot of the mattress. I squinted at the screen. The figure was wearing scrubs, dark blue, the same color the psych techs wore. The person was holding a clipboard. I felt a strange lurch in my chest because I recognized the posture, the build, the way the person stood with their weight slightly shifted to the left. It was me. I was on the monitor, standing in room 11, even though I was sitting in the observation booth. I stood up fast enough that my chair rolled backward and hit the wall. I looked down at myself. I was here, in the booth, wearing my scrubs, holding my clipboard. I looked back at the monitor. The figure in the room was still there, motionless, watching the patient. I checked the timestamp on the screen. 02:16. I checked the clock on the wall. 02:16. I was in 2 places at once. My hands were shaking as I opened the observation log to check the last documented entry. It was mine from 0200 hours, nothing since. I looked back at the monitor. The figure, the other me, turned and walked toward the door. The camera tracked the movement. The door didn't open, but the figure was gone. The room was empty except for the patient. I stood there for several minutes trying to rationalize it. Camera glitch, shadow, reflection. But the figure had been 3-dimensional, solid, moving with intention, and it had looked exactly like me. I decided to conduct the next check in person. I left the booth and walked down the corridor to room 11, my footsteps loud in the silence. I reached the door at 0228. I looked through the observation window. The patient was on the mattress, same position as before. No one else in the room. I unlocked the door and stepped inside just to be sure. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, with nowhere to hide. The patient didn't move. I scanned every corner, checked behind the door, confirmed I was alone. I stepped back out, locked the door, and documented the check. 0230. Patient resting, no changes. Visual and physical confirmation completed. I returned to the observation booth and sat down. I rewound the camera footage to 0216. I watched the entire sequence again. The figure appeared, stood near the mattress, turned, and vanished. I forwarded the footage to 0228 when I'd entered the room in person. The camera showed me walking in, looking around, and leaving. Only one version of me this time. Normal. I checked the other seclusion rooms. All feeds were functioning normally. No anomalies. I told myself it was a technical error. Corrupted footage, a brief lag that duplicated my image from an earlier check. It didn't make sense, but it was the only explanation I could accept. I continued my rounds, 0245. I walked to room 11 and looked through the window. The patient was still on the mattress. I documented the check and moved on. When I returned to the booth at 0250, I glanced at the live feed from room 11. The other me was there again, standing in the same spot holding the clipboard, looking down at the patient. This time I didn't hesitate. I left the booth immediately and half-jogged down the corridor. I reached room 11 in less than 30 seconds. I looked through the window. The room was empty except for the patient. I pulled out my keys, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The air was still. The patient's breathing was steady. There was no one else. I walked to the exact spot where I'd seen the figure on the monitor. I stood there, holding my clipboard, mimicking the posture. Then I looked up at the camera in the corner. I returned to the booth and reviewed the footage. The camera had recorded my entire visit. I saw myself enter, walk to the center of the room, and stand still for several seconds before leaving. But on the timestamp during the exact moments I'd been inside the room, there was also another figure visible on the feed. The other me, standing in the same position I'd just occupied, layered over my live movements like a double exposure. I could see both versions simultaneously. The me that was actually there and the me that shouldn't have been. I took a screenshot of the monitor and printed it. I needed proof that this was happening, something I could show Leonard or the shift supervisor. But when the image printed, it showed only one figure, just me, standing alone in the room. I looked back at the live feed. Both versions were still visible on the screen. I stopped conducting physical checks. I couldn't trust what I was seeing anymore. Instead, I documented the checks based solely on the camera feed, watching from the booth and noting the patient's condition without entering the room. But every time I looked at the monitor for room 11, I saw myself inside. Sometimes standing, sometimes sitting on the floor near the door, sometimes crouched beside the mattress, always holding the clipboard, always watching the patient. I reviewed the observation log. Every check was documented. My handwriting, my signature, the correct timestamps, but I had no memory of conducting half of them. At 4:30 a.m., Leonard radioed me from the West Wing. He asked if I'd been in room 11 recently. He said he'd walked past the seclusion corridor and saw someone inside through the observation window. That was probably me, I said, though I hadn't left the booth in over an hour. You were just standing there, Leonard said, not moving. I knocked on the window, but you didn't react. I thought maybe you were in some kind of freeze response, like the patient had done something. My stomach dropped. Room was empty, Leonard said. Just the patient. I didn't know what to say. Leonard asked. Yeah, I said. I wasn't tired, I was terrified. At 6 a.m., I completed the final seclusion check of my shift. I approached room 11 for what I promised myself would be the last time. I looked through the observation window. The patient was sitting upright on the mattress, facing the door. He was looking directly at me. His expression was calm, almost expectant. Behind him, standing against the far wall, was another version of me. This one wasn't holding a clipboard. Its arms hung at its sides. Its face was blank. I stepped back from the window. The patient smiled. I didn't document that check. I returned to the booth, gathered my things, and waited for the morning shift to arrive. When my replacement came at 7, I gave a brief report, mentioned nothing unusual, and left the building. I didn't sleep that day. I kept thinking about the footage, the logs, the version of me that appeared in places I hadn't been. I thought about Leonard seeing me in the room when I wasn't there. I thought about the patient's smile. I returned for my next shift 3 days later. I requested a different assignment, but staffing was short, so I was placed back in the East Wing. Back to the seclusion rooms. Room 11 was still occupied. I checked the observation log from the shifts I'd missed. Every check had been documented, my handwriting, my signature, but I hadn't been there. I conducted my rounds mechanically, avoiding room 11 as much as protocol allowed, but at 1:30 a.m. I had no choice. I walked to the door and looked through the window. The patient was gone. The mattress was empty. I radioed the charge nurse immediately. "Room 11 is empty." "Negative," she said. "Patient is still in seclusion per the treatment plan." She arrived within 2 minutes, checked the room herself, and confirmed it was empty. She radioed the supervisor. They initiated a facility-wide search. They found him 6 hours later, still in room 11. He'd been there the entire time. The camera footage showed him lying on the mattress through the entire shift. No gaps, no exits. He never left. But I'd seen the empty room, so had the charge nurse. I submitted my resignation the next morning. I didn't explain why. I didn't mention the footage or the doubled observations or the version of me that conducted checks I didn't remember. I don't know what happens in room 11 after midnight. I don't know if I was seeing myself in the future, the past, or some layered present where multiple versions of the same moment exist simultaneously. What I know is this. Seclusion rooms are designed to contain patients, but sometimes they contain other things. Observations that repeat without origin, checks that document themselves, and staff members who continue their rounds long after they've stopped walking the halls. Some routines don't end when the shift is over. They just keep looping, recorded and documented, appearing on camera feeds and observation logs, carried out by people who may not even know they're still working. And if you watch the monitors long enough, you'll see yourself in places you've never been, conducting checks you don't remember, observing patients who might not be the only ones under surveillance. Story 3, Progress Notes Revised. The note I'd written yesterday had changed. Not the clinical impression, that was the same, but the treatment recommendation at the end. Today it read, "Discontinue all medications. Patient demonstrates insight inconsistent with diagnosis." I checked the edit log. No revisions, no timestamp. Just my original entry now saying something I'd never written. My name is Dr. Elliot Brennan, and until 6 weeks ago I was a second-year psychiatry resident at Collingwood State Psychiatric Hospital. I'm providing this statement at the request of the medical board as part of an ongoing review into irregularities in patient documentation and treatment planning during my tenure. I've been advised that my account may be used in both administrative proceedings and potential litigation. I understand the gravity of that, and I'm prepared to describe exactly what happened, even though I'm not certain anyone will believe me. Psychiatry residency teaches you to observe, document, and revise. Progress notes are the backbone of psychiatric care. They track symptom evolution, treatment response, and clinical reasoning. Every note builds on the previous one, creating a narrative arc from admission to discharge. You learn to write with precision, to avoid ambiguity, and to document only what you directly observe or what the patient reports. Your notes become a legal record, a communication tool, and a reflection of your clinical judgment. I was assigned to the long-term inpatient unit, which housed patients with severe and persistent mental illness. My caseload included 12 patients. I conducted daily rounds, updated treatment plans, and wrote progress notes in the electronic medical record. It was repetitive work, but it taught you pattern recognition. How to identify subtle shifts in mood, behavior, and thought content that might indicate decompensation or improvement. One of my patients was a 41-year-old woman I'll refer to as Mary Klein. She'd been hospitalized for 8 months following a manic episode with psychotic features. Her diagnosis was bipolar disorder type 1. She'd been stable on a combination of mood stabilizers and antipsychotics for the past 3 months, attending groups, socializing appropriately, and expressing a desire to return home. The treatment team was considering discharge within the next few weeks. I wrote her progress notes every Tuesday and Friday per unit protocol. The notes followed a standard format: subjective report from the patient, objective observations, assessment of current status, and plan for ongoing treatment. It was formulaic, efficient, and exactly what was expected. On a Tuesday in late October, I completed my morning rounds and sat down to write Mary's note. She'd reported feeling well. Her mood was euthymic. Her speech was goal-directed, and she denied any hallucinations or delusions. I documented this, assessed her as stable, and recommended continuing her current medication regimen with a follow-up in 1 week. I submitted the note at 11:43 a.m. and moved on to my next patient. The following morning, I was reviewing my patient list when I noticed an alert on Mary's chart. It indicated that her progress note from the previous day had been flagged for clarification by the attending physician. I opened the note to see what had prompted the flag. The note looked different. The subjective and objective sections were the same: Mary's self-report, my observations, her mental status exam findings, but the assessment and plan had changed. Instead of patient remains stable on current medication regimen, it now read, patient demonstrates superficial stability masking underlying decompensation. And instead of continue current medications, the plan stated, increase monitoring frequency. I stared at the screen. I had not written those words. I had a clear memory of typing the original assessment and plan. I even remembered pausing to consider whether to recommend discharge planning and deciding it was premature. I checked the edit log at the bottom of the note. It showed only one entry, my original submission at 11:43 a.m. No subsequent edits, no co-signature or addendum from the attending. I assumed it was a system error, some kind of autofill glitch or template corruption. I contacted IT and explained the issue. They accessed my chart remotely and reviewed the note. They confirmed that there were no edits, no version history, and no evidence of tampering. They suggested that I might have misremembered what I'd written. I didn't misremember. I'd written hundreds of progress notes. I knew my phrasing, my clinical language, my documentation habits. The revised note didn't sound like me, but I couldn't prove it, so I let it go. 2 days later, I wrote Mary's Friday progress note. She continued to appear stable. I documented her participation in group therapy, her appropriate interactions with staff, and her expressed readiness for discharge. In the assessment section, I wrote, patient meets criteria for discharge planning. I submitted the note at 1:18 p.m. That evening, I logged back into the system to check on a medication order for another patient. While I was in the chart, I navigated to Mary's file and opened the progress note I'd written that afternoon. The assessment had changed. It now read, patient presents with superficial compliance. Observed whispering to unseen entities during group session. I had not written that. I had not observed Mary whispering to anyone, seen or unseen. She'd been fully engaged in the group, contributing appropriately, showing no signs of psychosis. I checked the edit log. One entry. My submission at 1:18 p.m. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my skull. I printed the note and compared it to the version on my screen. They were identical, including the assessment I hadn't written. I returned to the unit and pulled the charge nurse aside. I asked if she'd noticed anything unusual about Mary's behavior during the group session that afternoon. She said no. Mary had been pleasant, articulate, and appropriate throughout. I asked. The nurse looked puzzled. Not that I saw. Just checking, I said. I went back to the computer and wrote an addendum to the progress note, clarifying that my original assessment had indicated readiness for discharge planning and that I had not observed any psychotic symptoms. I submitted the addendum at 6:52 p.m. The next morning, I opened Mary's chart to review the addendum. It wasn't there. Instead, there was a new progress note dated the previous evening at 6:52 p.m. It was written under my name, with my credentials, in the same format as my usual notes. It read, "Resident expresses concern about patient's presentation, but demonstrates inconsistent clinical reasoning. Resident's documentation suggests possible countertransference or projection of anxiety onto patient." I read it 3 times. It was a note about me, written by me, submitted under my user ID. I had not written it. I called the attending physician, Dr. Maureen Lindsay, and asked to meet with her immediately. She agreed, and I went to her office with a printout of the note. "I didn't write this," I said, handing her the paper. She read it carefully, then looked up at me. "I know." She pulled up the chart on her computer and reviewed the note. "The edit log shows your user ID and timestamp." She studied me for a moment. "Elliot, have you been feeling unusually stressed?" I realized where this was going. "I'm not having a breakdown." "Or," she said gently, "you're writing things and not remembering. It happens. Residency is exhausting." I wanted to argue, but I could see it was pointless. From her perspective, I was a tired resident experiencing memory lapses and blaming the electronic medical record. "Let's do this," she said. "Take a few days off. Get some rest." I didn't take time off. I came in the next day and wrote Mary's Tuesday progress note. I documented her status with meticulous detail. I used precise, unambiguous language. I wrote the assessment longhand on paper before typing it into the system, so I'd have proof of my original wording. The assessment I wrote on paper read, "Patient continues to meet criteria for discharge. No psychotic symptoms observed, mood stable." I typed it into the computer exactly as written, word for word. I submitted the note at 10:21 a.m. I immediately printed a copy and placed it in my bag. That evening, I logged into the system and opened the note. The assessment had changed. It now read, "Resident continues to document inaccurate observations. Patient demonstrated clear signs of delusional thinking during interview, which resident failed to identify." I pulled out the handwritten version and the printed copy from that morning. Both showed my original assessment. The electronic version showed something I had not written. I took all 3 documents to Dr. Lindsay the next morning. I laid them out on her desk, handwritten, printed, and a new printout from the current system. "This is what I wrote," I said, pointing to the handwritten note. I pointed to the first printout. I pointed to the second printout. She examined all 3 documents. Her expression shifted from patience to concern. She asked, "I didn't touch it. No edits." She pulled up the chart and reviewed the edit history. "1 submission." She didn't answer. She printed her own copy of the current note, compared it to mine, and sat back in her chair. "I'll escalate this to IT and medical records," she said finally. "In the meantime, stop documenting in Mary's chart." I agreed. I avoided Mary's chart entirely, but 3 days later, a new progress note appeared in her file. It was dated the previous evening, submitted under my name with my user ID. It read, "Patient reports that resident has been visiting her room outside of scheduled rounds, asking unusual questions about reality testing and perception. Patient appears confused by resident's behavior." I had not visited Mary's room. I had not asked her any questions. I had not written the note. I went to the unit and asked to speak with Mary. The charge nurse told me that Dr. Lindsay had restricted my access to Mary per the care team's recommendation. I asked. She showed me the note, the one I hadn't written. I was placed on administrative leave the following day. Dr. Lindsay explained that it was precautionary, that there were concerns about my well-being and my documentation practices, and that I'd be required to undergo a fitness for duty evaluation before returning. I completed the evaluation. The psychiatrist found no evidence of psychosis, mood disorder, or cognitive impairment. I was cleared to return to work, but when I logged back into the system, I found new progress notes in my other patients' charts. Notes I hadn't written, documenting observations I hadn't made, raising concerns about my clinical judgment and behavior. Each note was submitted under my credentials. Each one had no edit history. I resigned before they could terminate me. I don't know what caused the documentation to change. I don't know if it was a system error, a deliberate manipulation, or something I can't begin to explain. I don't know if the notes reflected something true that I couldn't see, whether I was the one losing insight, whether my memory was failing, whether I was documenting things I didn't remember. What I know is this: progress notes are supposed to create clarity. They're supposed to track change over time to build a coherent narrative. But sometimes the narrative writes itself. Sometimes the assessment changes without the clinician's input. And sometimes the person being evaluated isn't the patient. It's the one holding the pen, writing observations that will be revised by something or someone else, turning your documentation into evidence of your own unreliability. I kept copies of my handwritten notes. I still have them. I compare them to the electronic versions sometimes just to confirm that I remember correctly, that I wrote what I thought I wrote. But even now, I'll glance at those handwritten pages and find a sentence I don't remember writing, a clinical impression that doesn't sound like mine, and I'll wonder if the revision started earlier than I realized, if the changes began not in the computer system but in my own hand, writing words I didn't choose, documenting observations I didn't make, building a case against myself in a file I'll never stop updating. Some progress notes revise themselves. Some treatment plans evolve without intervention, and some charts document the clinician more thoroughly than the patient, creating a record that will long outlast the person who thought they were in control of the narrative. Story 4. Medication Administration Record Discrepancy. The pharmacy called to confirm an order. 50 milligrams of lorazepam, administered intramuscularly for patient bed 9. I told them bed 9 had been discharged 4 days ago. The pharmacist paused, then said, "We've been filling this order every shift since discharge." I pulled up the EMR. She was right. My signature, my handwriting, documenting doses given to a patient who was no longer in the building. My name is Helen Corrigan, and I worked as an inpatient psychiatric nurse at Whitmore Behavioral Center for 13 years, before I was placed on indefinite leave. I'm submitting this statement to the State Nursing Board as part of the investigation into medication administration irregularities during my employment. I've been advised to provide a full account of the events leading to my suspension. I'll do so to the best of my ability, though I recognize how implausible parts of this will sound. Medication administration in a psychiatric unit follows strict protocols. Every dose is documented on a medication administration record, the MAR. You scan the patient's wristband, verify the medication against the physician's order, administer the dose, and initial the record in real time. Controlled substances require dual verification. Errors are investigated immediately. The system is designed to prevent mistakes, diversion, and harm. I'd been working the evening shift, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., for most of my tenure. I knew the routine by muscle memory. Medication pass started at 5 p.m. and again at 9 p.m. I prepared the doses in the medication room, loaded them onto a cart, and moved from bed to bed, verifying and administering each one. It took about 90 minutes per pass, depending on the census. In mid-September, we admitted a 56-year-old woman to bed 9. I'll refer to her as Patricia Drummond. She'd been brought in by police after a public disturbance involving paranoid delusions and aggression. She was involuntarily committed and placed on a 72-hour hold. Her orders included an antipsychotic, a mood stabilizer, and PRN lorazepam for acute agitation. Patricia was a difficult patient. She refused medications, accused staff of poisoning her, and required frequent de-escalation. On her second night, she became combative during the evening medication pass. The physician ordered 2 milligrams of lorazepam intramuscularly to manage the acute agitation. I administered the injection with the help of 2 psych techs. Patricia calmed within 20 minutes. I documented the administration on the MAR. 2 milligrams lorazepam IM given at 1800 hours for acute agitation. Patient tolerated without adverse effects. I signed and dated it. The 72-hour hold was extended to 14 days due to continued symptoms. Patricia remained on the unit, though her behavior improved slightly. She still refused most oral medications, requiring occasional IM doses when her agitation escalated. On September 23rd, Patricia's family arrived with legal representation and successfully petitioned for her release. The court found that she was not an imminent danger to herself or others and ordered her discharge. She left the facility at 2 p.m. that afternoon. I was not on shift when she was discharged, but I saw the note in the chart the next day. Patient discharged September 23rd at 1400 hours per court order. Discharge instructions provided. Follow-up scheduled with outpatient provider. I worked the evening shift on September 24th. During the 5 p.m. medication pass, I loaded the cart as usual and began making rounds. When I reached bed 9, I stopped. The bed was empty. It had been stripped and cleaned after Patricia's discharge. There was no patient. I moved on to bed 10. At the end of the pass, I returned to the medication room to document. I pulled up the electronic MAR and began initialing each administered dose. When I reached Patricia Drummond's record, I paused. There was an entry for September 24th at 1700 hours, 2 milligrams lorazepam IM, my initials, my handwriting on the paper backup log. I stared at it. I had not administered lorazepam to Patricia. She wasn't on the unit. She'd been discharged. I checked the discharge note again to confirm. Yes, discharged September 23rd. I assumed it was a clerical error, maybe a dose from before her discharge that I'd forgotten to document and the system had auto-populated with the wrong date. I flagged it for correction and moved on. The next day, the pharmacy called me during my shift. The pharmacist, a woman named Laura, asked if I could confirm an order. "We've been filling a lorazepam order for bed 9, she said. 2 milligrams IM, PRN agitation, but the patient in bed 9 was discharged 2 days ago." "No," I said. "Discontinue it." There was a pause. "Helen, we've been sending the doses up every day since discharge." My chest tightened. The MAR shows your initials for every dose. September 24th, September 25th, and today, September 26th. I told her I'd look into it and ended the call. I pulled up the MAR. She was right. 3 entries since discharge, all showing 2 milligrams lorazepam IM given to Patricia Drummond in bed 9. My initials on each one. I had not administered any of those doses. I hadn't even pulled lorazepam from the medication room since Patricia left. I checked the controlled substance log. Lorazepam was a Schedule 4 medication, which meant every dose dispensed was tracked. The log showed that 2 milligrams had been removed from inventory on September 24th, 25th, and 26th, documented under my name, verified by my badge scan, but I hadn't removed it. I hadn't administered it. There was no patient to give it to. I reported the discrepancy to the charge nurse. She reviewed the records with me and confirmed that the entries existed. She checked the automated dispensing cabinet, the machine that stored controlled substances, and pulled the access log. The log showed my badge scanned at 1650 hours on September 24th, 25th, and 26th. Each scan corresponded with the removal of 1 vial of lorazepam. She asked. No. She looked at me for a long moment. I'm not diverting medication. I didn't take it. She escalated the issue to the nurse manager, who escalated it to the pharmacy director. An investigation was opened. They reviewed video footage from the medication room. The footage from September 24th showed me entering the medication room at 1650 hours. I approached the dispensing cabinet, scanned my badge, removed a vial of lorazepam, and placed it in my medication cart. I left the room and proceeded to the unit. I watched the footage with the pharmacy director. I had no memory of doing any of that. He asked. That's me, I said. No, because I didn't. He played the footage from September 25th and 26th. Same sequence. I entered the room, scanned my badge, removed lorazepam, and left. Helen, he said carefully, do you have any history of memory issues? Have you been under unusual stress? I'm fine, but the footage showed otherwise. They placed me on administrative leave pending further investigation. I was required to submit to a drug screen and a fitness for duty evaluation. Both came back normal. During my leave, I requested access to the full medication logs for Bed 9. They provided them under legal advisement. The entries continued. September 27th, 2 milligrams lorazepam IM, my initials. September 28th, same. September 29th, same. I wasn't even in the building. I was on leave. I contacted the nurse manager and told her that someone was using my credentials, that my badge had been cloned or my account hacked. She said they'd reviewed the access logs and video footage. Every entry corresponded with footage of me, physically me, entering the medication room, removing lorazepam, and leaving. That's impossible, I said. She didn't respond. I drove to the facility and asked to see the footage myself. They allowed it, with supervision. The video from September 27th showed me entering the medication room at 1652 hours. Same routine, badge scan, medication removal, exit. I was wearing the same scrubs I always wore. Same ponytail, same gait. It was me. But I had been at home that day. I'd gone grocery shopping. I had receipts, timestamps on my credit card statement, a conversation with my neighbor in the parking lot. This isn't possible, I said aloud. The pharmacy director, who was sitting beside me, said, Helen, I think you need to speak with someone. A counselor, maybe a neurologist. I left the facility and didn't return. I hired an attorney. We requested a full forensic audit of the medication records, badge access logs, and video footage. The audit found no evidence of tampering, no duplicate accounts, no external access. Everything traced back to me. The attorney suggested that we argue a case of system malfunction or administrative error. But the video footage made that difficult. The person on camera was indistinguishable from me. I started having dreams about the medication room. In the dreams, I walked to the dispensing cabinet, scanned my badge, removed the lorazepam, and brought it to Bed 9. The bed was always occupied. Patricia Drummond was always there, lying on her back, staring at the ceiling. I administered the injection. She didn't react. I documented it on the MAR. Then I left the room and started the sequence over again. I'd wake up with my hand cramping as if I'd been writing. The entries in the MAR continued through October. 2 milligrams lorazepam IM every evening at 1700 hours documented under my name. I stopped checking after a while. There was no point. In early November, I received a call from the State Nursing Board. They informed me that my license was under review due to the unresolved medication discrepancies. They asked if I had any additional information to provide. I didn't know what to tell them. That I was administering medication to a patient who wasn't there? That I was somehow physically present in a building I hadn't entered? That surveillance footage documented actions I had no memory of performing? I told them I had nothing further to add. Last week, I received a letter from the facility. It was a formal incident report documenting a medication error. The report stated that on November 14th, a dose of lorazepam had been administered to bed 9, which was unoccupied. The administration was documented under my credentials. The report recommended permanent revocation of my nursing license. November 14th was yesterday. I was at home yesterday. I didn't leave the house. I have no memory of going to the facility. But the video footage, according to the report, shows me entering the medication room at 1650 hours. Badge scan, medication removal, administration to an empty bed. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if I'm losing time, if I'm sleepwalking, if someone has replicated my identity so precisely that even video surveillance can't distinguish us. I don't know if Patricia Drummond ever actually left, or if discharge records mean anything at all when the treatment continues without interruption. What I know is this. Some orders never get discontinued. Some patients remain on the MAR long after they've gone, and some nurses continue their medication passes, shift after shift, documenting doses that shouldn't exist, administering care to beds that should be empty, their signatures appearing on records they don't remember creating. I still get calls from the pharmacy sometimes asking me to verify orders. I tell them I'm not working anymore. They say they know. But the doses keep getting filled and the MAR keeps updating, and somewhere in that building, someone who looks exactly like me is still making evening rounds, still scanning their badge, still bringing medication to bed 9, and the patient, if there ever was one, never complains. Story 5, Group Therapy Transcript, Session 12. I was reviewing the audio recording when I heard the voice. It wasn't any of the regular participants. I knew all their cadences, their speech patterns. This voice was calm, measured, asking questions I should have asked but didn't. The group responded to it naturally, as if the speaker had been there the entire session. I checked the attendance sheet. 8 participants, 8 chairs in the circle. But on the recording there were 9 voices. My name is Virginia Ashford, and I worked as a licensed clinical social worker at Belmont Psychiatric Institute for 14 years. I'm providing this statement as requested by the Clinical Oversight Board following the suspension of my therapeutic license. I've been asked to account for irregularities in my group therapy documentation and audio recordings from sessions conducted between late August and mid-October of last year. I will describe the events as I experienced them, though I recognize that my account raises questions about my own perceptions and reliability. Group therapy sessions on an inpatient psychiatric unit serve multiple functions: peer support, socialization, emotional processing, and skills development. I facilitated 2 weekly groups, one focused on coping strategies, the other on interpersonal relationships. Each session lasted 60 minutes. I recorded every session for supervision and quality assurance purposes. The recordings were stored on a secure server and reviewed periodically by my supervisor. Group sessions were held in the activities room, a large space with windows overlooking the courtyard, a circle of chairs and a whiteboard. Attendance varied depending on patient census and acuity, typically ranging from 6 to 10 participants. I maintained an attendance log, documented participation levels, and wrote session summaries after each group. Session 12 of the Coping Strategies group took place on September 19th. 8 patients attended. I documented their names on the attendance sheet: Michael Brennan, Olivia Marsh, Kenneth Dale, Alice Pritchard, Samuel Roth, Janet Keene, Raymond Corbin, and Laura Fenton. I arranged 9 chairs in a circle, 8 for participants, 1 for me. I placed the digital recorder on a small table in the center of the circle and pressed record at 1400 hours. The session proceeded normally. I introduced the topic, distress tolerance skills, and facilitated a discussion about strategies for managing overwhelming emotions. Michael talked about using deep breathing. Olivia mentioned journaling. Kenneth described going for walks. Each participant contributed in turn. I asked follow-up questions, validated their experiences, and offered additional coping techniques. The group dynamic was positive. Everyone participated. The session ended at 1500 hours. I stopped the recording, thanked the participants, and returned to my office to write the session summary. I uploaded the audio file to the secure server and labeled it Session 12, September 19th, Coping Strategies. I wrote the summary noting high engagement and appropriate participation from all members. I saved the document and moved on to my other duties. 3 days later, my supervisor, Dr. Raymond Holt, asked to meet with me. He said he'd been reviewing my recent session recordings as part of routine supervision. He asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about Session 12. Not particularly, I said. He asked. He opened his laptop and played a segment of the recording. I heard my voice introducing the topic, then Michael's voice responding, normal. Then I heard another voice. It was calm, measured, asking a question. Michael, when you use deep breathing, do you find that it changes your awareness of time? I didn't recognize the voice. I leaned closer to the laptop. Michael responded on the recording. Yeah, actually, it's like everything slows down. I feel more... The unfamiliar voice continued. And does that ever frighten you? Michael paused before answering. Sometimes. I remembered this exchange. I remembered Michael talking about deep breathing making him feel grounded. But I didn't remember anyone asking him those questions. I thought I had asked them. I asked Dr. Holt. He played more of the recording. The unfamiliar voice appeared multiple times throughout the session, asking insightful questions, gently redirecting the conversation, offering reflections. The group members responded naturally, as if the speaker were a regular participant. Virginia, you documented 8 participants, Dr. Holt said. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. That's impossible. There were 8 patients and me. I don't know. I tried to remember. I had a clear memory of the session. 8 patients, sitting in a circle, no interruptions. No. Dr. Holt played another segment. The unfamiliar voice said, let's take a moment to notice what we're feeling right now. I remembered saying that. I had a visceral memory of speaking those words, of seeing the group members close their eyes and turn their attention inward. But the voice on the recording wasn't mine. I think there's an audio glitch, I said. I checked, Dr. Holt said, and the file hasn't been altered. No corruption, no mixing. I didn't know what to say. I want you to listen to the full recording, he said. Take notes on every instance where this voice appears. I returned to my office and played the entire session from start to finish. I listened with headphones, focusing intently on every word. The unfamiliar voice appeared 17 times. It asked open-ended questions, validated emotions, provided psychoeducation, and summarized key points. It spoke in the cadence of an experienced therapist, It never interrupted, never spoke over anyone, and always contributed in a way that enhanced the group process. But I had no memory of anyone else speaking in that session. I remembered facilitating the entire group myself. I checked the attendance sheet again. 8 names. I counted the chairs in the activities room the next morning. 9 chairs had been arranged in a circle. I always set up 9. 8 for participants, 1 for me. But if the 9th voice wasn't mine, whose chair were they sitting in? I met with Dr. Holt the following day and shared my notes. He reviewed them and asked, "Do you have any history of dissociative symptoms? Any recent stressors?" "No." He didn't look convinced. "I'm going to ask you to take a temporary leave while we sort this out." "I don't need a leave." "So do I," he said. I didn't take a leave. I continued facilitating my groups, but I paid closer attention. I counted participants before each session. I noted who sat where. I focused on my own voice, my own contributions, to make sure I wasn't somehow missing portions of the sessions. On September 26th, I facilitated session 13. 7 participants attended. I documented their names, arranged 8 chairs, and started the recording. The session proceeded normally. I asked questions, guided the discussion, provided feedback. I was hyper-aware of every word I spoke. After the session, I listened to the recording immediately. The unfamiliar voice was there again. This time it said, "Virginia, you mentioned earlier that some emotions feel too big to contain." I froze. The voice had addressed me, by name. I listened to my response on the recording, but I had no memory of being asked that question. I remembered asking the group about overwhelming emotions, but I didn't remember anyone asking me. I played the segment again. The question was clear, directed at me, and I had responded as if it were perfectly natural. I checked the attendance log. 7 participants, not 8. I returned to the activities room and counted the chairs. 8 chairs arranged in a circle, 7 participants. 1 facilitator, 8 chairs. The math didn't work. I reported this to Dr. Holt. He listened to the recording and confirmed that the unfamiliar voice had addressed me directly. He asked if I remembered answering the question. "I remember talking about overwhelming emotions," I said. "Virginia," he said quietly, "I think you need to see someone. A colleague, maybe a neurologist." I agreed to see a neurologist. The evaluation was normal. No signs of seizure activity, no cognitive impairment, no structural abnormalities. But the voice continued. Session 14, session 15, session 16. Every recording included the unfamiliar voice, asking questions, guiding the process, sometimes addressing me directly. The participants responded to it naturally. I responded to it naturally. But I had no memory of it being there. In early October, one of the group members, Michael Brennan, asked to speak with me privately after a session. He seemed uneasy. He said. My heart stopped. "The person who co-leads the group with you, they ask really good questions, but I've never seen them before or after the group. They just..." I kept my voice steady. Michael frowned. "I don't know. I can't really picture them. I think so." I thanked him and ended the conversation. I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me. I pulled the video surveillance footage from the activities room for session 12. The facility had cameras in all common areas for safety monitoring. I requested the footage from September 19th, 1400 to 1500 hours. The footage showed 8 patients sitting in a circle. It showed me sitting in the 9th chair facing the group. No one else was present. No one entered or exited during the session, but the audio from the surveillance footage matched the recording from my device. The unfamiliar voice was audible on the camera's microphone. The voice was in the room, but no one was there. I submitted my resignation in mid-October. I told Dr. Holt that I needed to step away for personal reasons. He accepted without question. I think he was relieved. I haven't facilitated a group since, but sometimes late at night I'll listen to the recordings again. I'll hear that voice asking questions I should have asked, providing insights I should have offered, guiding the group with a skill and presence I thought was mine. And I'll wonder if I was ever really the facilitator, or if I was just another participant responding to prompts I couldn't see, contributing to a process I didn't control, sitting in a circle with someone, something, that understood group dynamics better than I ever could. Some sessions are co-facilitated without anyone knowing. Some voices speak without bodies. Some participants attend every group and never sign the attendance sheet, guiding conversations from a chair that should be empty, asking questions that should never be answered, and leaving behind recordings that prove they were there even when the cameras show they weren't. And sometimes the person learning the most in a therapy session isn't the patient. It's the facilitator who realizes too late that they've been answering questions posed by someone who was never really there. Someone who's been running the group all along, transcript after transcript, teaching lessons that no clinical training ever prepared them to receive. Story 6. Incident report. Staff injury. The report was dated 3 days from now. It described an incident that hadn't happened yet. A physical altercation during a restraint procedure resulting in a fractured wrist and lacerations to my left forearm. The injuries were documented with clinical precision. Exact location, wound dimensions, treatment protocol. I looked down at my hands. No injuries. No marks. But the report included photographs, time-stamped 72 hours in the future, showing wounds I would receive but hadn't yet sustained. My name is Graham Whitmore, and I served as the psychiatric ward supervisor at Ridgecrest Mental Health Facility for 16 years, before my termination last month. I am submitting this statement at the request of my legal counsel as part of a wrongful termination claim, and in response to the facility's allegations regarding my fitness for duty and my handling of incident reports during my final weeks of employment. I recognize the seriousness of these claims, and I intend to provide a complete and truthful account of what occurred, even though I fully expect it to be dismissed as fabrication or delusion. Incident reports are foundational documents in psychiatric care. They capture adverse events, patient aggression, staff injuries, medication errors, falls, elopements, and any deviation from standard care. As ward supervisor, I reviewed every incident report filed during my shift, ensured timely investigation, and submitted finalized reports to administration within 24 hours. The process was bureaucratic, exhaustive, and essential for maintaining safety and accountability. Incident reports followed a standardized format: date and time of incident, individuals involved, detailed description of events, immediate response, injuries sustained, corrective actions, and supervisor review. Each report required signatures from the staff member who filed it, the shift supervisor, and often the clinical director. Reports were filed electronically and stored in a centralized database with automatic time stamping. On October 9th, I arrived for my shift at 3 p.m. and conducted my usual review of the previous 24 hours. I checked patient status updates, reviewed staffing assignments, and opened the incident report database to see if any new reports had been filed. There was one new entry submitted earlier that morning. The report number was IR-7832. The date of the incident was listed as October 12th. I stared at the screen. October 12th was 3 days away. Today was October 9th. I assumed it was a clerical error. Someone had mistyped the date. I opened the report to correct it. The report described a physical altercation involving a patient in acute distress and a restraint team consisting of 4 staff members, including me. According to the narrative, the patient had become combative during medication administration, striking a nurse. The restraint team was called at 1900 hours on October 12th. During the restraint procedure, the patient thrashed violently, causing me to fall and sustain injuries to my left forearm and right wrist. The injuries were documented in clinical detail: 2-inch laceration to the volar surface of the left forearm, distal radius fracture of the right wrist, swelling and ecchymosis consistent with blunt force trauma. Treatment included wound irrigation, suturing, splinting, and orthopedic referral. The report was signed by the nurse who allegedly filed it, a woman named Denise Carmichael, who worked the evening shift on my unit. It was countersigned by me with my digital signature and credentials. I looked at my hands. No injuries, no bruising, no swelling, no wounds. I checked my schedule. I was assigned to work the evening shift on October 12th, but that shift hadn't happened yet. I called Denise Carmichael into my office and showed her the report. She looked at the screen, confused. "No, your name is on it." She leaned closer. "That's my signature, but I didn't write this." She looked at me. "Is this some kind of test?" "No." I contacted IT and explained the issue. They accessed the database remotely and confirmed that the report existed, that it had been submitted at 6:23 a.m. on October 9th, and that the timestamp and signatures were valid. They found no evidence of backdating or tampering. I asked. "No," the technician said. "The timestamp pulls from the server, not the local device." "I know," he said. I flagged the report as erroneous and archived it. I sent a memo to staff reminding them to double-check dates before submitting reports. I assumed the issue was a database glitch that would resolve itself. On October 10th, another incident report appeared, IR-7833. Date of incident, October 13th. This report described a medication error. A patient had been administered the wrong dosage of an antipsychotic due to a transcription error in the electronic medical record. The patient experienced acute dystonia, a severe muscle spasm, and required emergency intervention with diphenhydramine. The report listed me as the supervising nurse who had failed to catch the error during my chart review. The report was filed by a psychiatric nurse named Donald Kemp. It was countersigned by me. I had not reviewed any charts yet for October 13th. October 13th was 3 days away. I called Donald into my office. He denied filing the report. I showed him his signature. He confirmed it looked authentic but insisted he hadn't written it. I checked the database. The report had been submitted at 1400 hours on October 10th, today, but it described events occurring on October 13th. I escalated the issue to the clinical director, a woman named Dr. Pamela Ives. I explained the situation, showed her both reports, and requested a full IT audit of the database. She reviewed the reports carefully. "Do you have any concerns about the patients mentioned?" I hadn't considered that angle. I checked the patient names listed in the reports. Both were currently stable, no recent escalations, no red flags in their charts. "No," I said. "Then I think we're looking at a technical issue," Dr. Ives said. "I'll have IT investigate." I archived the second report and returned to my duties. On October 11th, I checked the database again. There were 3 new incident reports, all dated October 14th. All described incidents that hadn't happened. All included my name as the supervisor involved. One report described a patient elopement during my shift. Another described a fall resulting in a head injury. The third described a verbal altercation between staff members that I had allegedly failed to de-escalate. Each report included my signature. I didn't file them. I didn't witness the incidents. The incidents hadn't occurred. I stopped archiving the reports. Instead, I printed them and placed them in a folder on my desk. I wanted physical copies in case the database was wiped or altered. On October 12th, I arrived for my evening shift with a growing sense of dread. According to the first report, I would be injured during a restraint procedure at 1900 hours. I checked the unit. The patient mentioned in the report, a man I'll call Stephen Pritchard, was calm, cooperative, sitting in the day room watching television. I pulled his chart. No concerning behaviors in the past week. No PRN medications administered. No treatment plan changes. There was no reason to expect an altercation. I kept a close eye on him throughout the shift. At 1800 hours, he attended the evening meal without incident. At 1830, he returned to the day room. At 1845, I checked on him again. Still calm. At 1855, the nurse assigned to Stephen approached me. "Stephen's refusing his evening meds." My heart rate spiked. "I'm not sure. He was fine 5 minutes ago." I went to the day room. Stephen was standing near the window, his fists clenched, his speech rapid and pressured. He was exhibiting clear signs of escalating paranoia. I attempted verbal de-escalation. He didn't respond. He began shouting, accusing staff of conspiring against him. He shoved a chair toward the nurse. I called for the restraint team. They arrived within 2 minutes. 4 staff members, including me. We approached Stephen using standard crisis intervention protocols. Calm voices, non-threatening postures, clear directives. Stephen lunged at the nurse. I moved to intercept. He thrashed, his elbow connecting with my right wrist. I fell backward, catching my left forearm on the edge of a table. Pain shot through my arm. I looked down and saw blood, a 2-inch laceration on my left forearm. My right wrist was already swelling. The restraint team subdued Stephen and escorted him to a seclusion room. I was taken to the on-site clinic. The wound on my forearm required irrigation and suturing. An X-ray confirmed a distal radius fracture of my right wrist. They applied a splint and scheduled an orthopedic follow-up. The nurse who treated me documented the injuries in an incident report. She asked me to review and sign it before she submitted it. I read the report. It was identical to IR-7832, the report I'd found 3 days earlier. Same description, same injuries, same treatment, same timestamp. 1900 hours, October 12th. I asked her. "Just now," she said. "Can you check the database?" She looked at me like I was confused, probably from the pain, but she checked. I didn't argue. I signed the report. She submitted it. When I returned to my office, I pulled the folder from my desk and found the printed copy of IR-7832. I compared it to the version the nurse had just submitted. They were identical, word for word, including the photographs of my injuries which had been attached to the report I'd printed on October 9th, 3 days before the injuries occurred. I went home that night with my arm in a sling and my wrist splinted. I didn't sleep. The next morning, October 13th, I opened the incident report database. There was a new report filed at 0800 hours, IR-7841, date of incident, October 16th. This report described a suicide attempt by a patient during my shift. The patient had fashioned a ligature from a bedsheet and was found unresponsive. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. The report noted that I had failed to identify warning signs during my rounds and that my negligence had contributed to the patient's death. The report was signed by Dr. Ives and countersigned by me. I checked the patient census. The patient named in the report, a woman I'll call Angela Moss, was on the unit. She was stable, engaged in treatment, and had not exhibited any suicidal ideation in recent days. I went to the unit and checked on Angela personally. She greeted me warmly, asked about my injuries, and participated in morning group therapy without incident. I called Dr. Ives and told her about the report. She pulled it up on her computer and went silent. "Graham," she said finally, "this report describes an incident on October 16th. I didn't. I had considered it, but I knew I wasn't. I couldn't explain the photographs of injuries I hadn't yet sustained, the detailed descriptions of events that hadn't yet occurred, the timestamps that predated the incidents by days. I'm not filing them," I said. She paused. "I think you should take a leave of absence. I think you're under significant stress, and these reports are concerning. Whether they're being generated by you, the system, or something else, they're creating a safety issue." I refused. I told her I would continue working, that I would personally monitor every patient mentioned in the reports, that I would prevent the incidents from occurring. On October 16th, Angela Moss was found unresponsive in her room at 2100 hours. Ligature strangulation. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead at 2146. I had checked on her at 2000 hours. She'd been in bed, resting quietly, no visible distress. 45 minutes later, she was gone. The incident report was filed by the Nightshift nurse. It was identical to the report I'd seen 3 days earlier. Dr. Ives placed me on immediate administrative leave. She said there would be an investigation into the incident and into my handling of the pre-filed reports. She suggested I seek psychiatric evaluation. I was terminated 2 weeks later. The facility cited gross negligence, failure to act on documented warnings, and inability to perform supervisory duties. I don't know where the reports came from. I don't know if they were predictions, warnings, or documentation from a timeline I didn't understand. I don't know if I could have prevented the incidents or if they were inevitable, written into a report that existed before the events themselves. What I know is this: some incident reports describe the past, some describe the future, and some describe a present that hasn't arrived yet, detailing injuries, errors, and deaths with a precision that makes you wonder if the report caused the incident or if the incident existed first, waiting to be documented, waiting to be signed, waiting for someone to recognize that the file was always there, time-stamped and sealed, long before the blood was drawn or the patient was found or the supervisor realized they were reading their own termination in a document they never should have seen. Some reports close cases before they open, some investigations conclude before they begin, and some signatures appear on pages that shouldn't exist, authorizing events that feel like choices but might be inevitabilities. Written in digital ink that never dries and never fades, documenting a sequence of moments that loop and repeat, incident after incident, timestamp after timestamp, until you can't tell if you're preventing the future or simply fulfilling it. One report at a time. Story 7. Patient Belongings Inventory. The locker was full again. I'd emptied it that morning, logged every item, sealed the bag, sent it to storage. But when I returned after lunch, the locker contained different belongings, same patient name on the label, but the contents had changed. A watch I hadn't seen before, a journal with entries dated years in the future, a photograph of someone I recognized but couldn't place. I checked the inventory log. It showed only the original contents. Nothing about what was now inside. My name is Rita Callahan, and I worked as a ward clerk and records custodian at Ashford Psychiatric Center for 8 years before I submitted my resignation last month. I'm providing this statement voluntarily, though I've been told it may be included in the facility's review of procedural compliance and records management. I've been asked to describe the irregularities I observed regarding patient belongings, specifically those stored in locker C of the personal property room. I will document what I witnessed as clearly as I can. Patient belongings were processed upon admission following strict protocol. Items were inventoried in the patient's presence, documented on a standardized form, sealed in a labeled bag, and stored in a locked room. Each locker in the property room was assigned to a specific patient, identified by name and medical record number. Belongings were returned upon discharge or transferred to family if the patient was relocated. The system was designed to be straightforward and secure. I was responsible for maintaining the property logs, processing new admissions, and coordinating returns. The property room was small, maybe 12 feet by 15 feet, with metal lockers lining 2 walls and a desk in the corner where I completed the paperwork. The room had no windows. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The air always smelled faintly of cardboard and disinfectant. Locker C had been assigned to a patient I'll refer to as Thomas Whitley. He'd been admitted on August 14th, a voluntary admission following a depressive episode. His belongings were typical: wallet, keys, cell phone, a paperback book, a wristwatch, and the clothes he'd arrived in. I inventoried each item, wrote the descriptions on the intake form, and placed everything in a sealed bag labeled with his name and medical record number. I locked the bag in Locker C and filed the intake form. Thomas was discharged after 2 weeks of treatment. On August 29th, I retrieved his belongings from Locker C, verified the inventory against the intake form, and returned everything to him. He signed the release form, confirmed receipt, and left the facility. I documented the discharge in the log and noted that Locker C was now empty and available for reassignment. The next day, I received a request to process belongings for a new admission. I opened the property room, unlocked Locker C, and found it full. I stopped, confused. I'd emptied the locker the previous day. I pulled the bag out and checked the label. It read Thomas Whitley with his medical record number. I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe I'd accidentally placed a duplicate bag in the locker. Or someone else had returned items without updating the log. I opened the bag. The contents were different. Instead of the wallet, keys, and cell phone I'd inventoried on August 14th, the bag contained a wristwatch I didn't recognize, a small notebook with a worn leather cover, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, and a photograph in a cracked frame. I pulled out the photograph and examined it. It showed a man standing in front of a white building, smiling at the camera. The man looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place him. I checked the intake form filed for Thomas Whitley. It listed the original items: wallet, keys, cell phone, book, watch, and clothing. No mention of a notebook, glasses, or photograph. I checked the discharge log. It confirmed that I had returned Thomas's belongings on August 29th, and that he had signed the release form. I called the admissions desk to ask if Thomas had been readmitted. They said no, he hadn't returned. I assumed the locker had been mislabeled or that someone had placed the wrong bag inside. I removed the bag, set it aside, and logged the locker as empty. I assigned it to the new admission and continued with the intake process. 2 days later, I returned to the property room to retrieve belongings for a different patient. As I passed Locker C, I noticed it was closed but not locked. I opened it. It was full again. The same bag labeled Thomas Whitley, containing the same unfamiliar items. I pulled the bag out and brought it to my desk. I inventoried the contents again: wristwatch, notebook, glasses, photograph. I opened the notebook and flipped through the pages. The handwriting was neat and small, filled with dated entries like a journal. I checked the dates. The entries spanned from September 5th to October 21st. Today was September 1st. The journal contained entries written in the future. I read one entry dated September 12th. They keep asking me the same questions. Do you feel safe? Do you have thoughts of harming yourself? The answers don't change, but they keep asking. I think they're testing to see if I remember my previous responses. I do, I always do. But I'm starting to wonder if they do. I closed the notebook and placed it back in the bag. I checked the photograph again. The man in the image looked more familiar now. I realized with a cold jolt that he resembled Thomas Whitley. Older, grayer, but the same basic features. I checked Thomas's patient file. His discharge summary included a photograph taken during the intake process. I compared it to the photograph from the locker. They were the same person, but the photograph from the locker showed him at least 10 years older. I reported the issue to my supervisor, a woman named Karen Hobbs. I showed her the bag, the inventory form, and the discharge log. She examined everything carefully. "Rita, you documented that you returned Thomas's belongings on August 29th, she said. "I did." "Yes, twice." She checked the intake form again. Karen suggested that someone might be pranking me, placing the bag in the locker as a joke. She said she'd review security footage from the property room to see if anyone had accessed it without authorization. The footage showed no one entering the property room except me. The locker remained closed and undisturbed between my visits. But each time I opened it, the bag was there. Karen instructed me to remove the bag and store it in a separate location, off-site if necessary, to see if the locker would remain empty. I placed the bag in a sealed bin in my car trunk. I locked locker C and left the property room. The next morning, I opened locker C to assign it to a new patient. The bag was inside. Same label, same contents. I checked my car. The bin was still in my trunk, sealed, containing the bag I'd placed there the previous day. There were now 2 identical bags, both labeled Thomas Whitley, both containing the same items. I brought both bags to Karen. She examined them side by side. The labels were identical. The handwriting on the notebook pages was identical. Even the crack in the photograph frame followed the same pattern. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "Do you think Thomas left duplicate belongings somehow?" She didn't have an answer. I returned both bags to the property room and locked them in a cabinet separate from the lockers. I left locker C open and empty. I documented everything in the log, noting the date, time, and contents of both bags. The following morning, locker C was full again. A third bag, identical to the first 2. I stopped trying to remove the bags. Instead, I started reading the notebook. The entries described life on the psychiatric unit from Thomas's perspective. He wrote about the routine, the medications, the therapy sessions. But he also wrote about things that didn't align with his documented stay. He described events that occurred after his discharge, conversations with staff members who'd been hired after he left, meals served on dates when he was no longer a patient, groups he attended weeks after his release. One entry, dated September 19th, read, "Rita found the belongings again today. She doesn't understand yet. I tried to leave, but the belongings stay. They document what I can't finish. Every time I think I've been discharged, I find myself back here in the same bed answering the same questions. The intake process never really ends. They just keep updating the file and I keep signing forms I don't remember reading." I checked the date. September 19th was 2 weeks away. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I placed the notebook back in the bag and locked it in the cabinet. On September 19th, I arrived at work and checked my desk. There was a message from the admissions coordinator. "Thomas Whitley readmitted September 18th at 2200 hours. Please process belongings intake." I went to the property room. Thomas's bag was on my desk, unsealed, waiting to be inventoried. I opened it. Inside were the same items I'd seen weeks ago. Wristwatch, notebook, glasses, photograph. I flipped open the notebook to the last entry. It was dated today, September 19th. Rita is reading this now. She's realized that some admissions don't end with discharge. Some patients remain in the system, their belongings cycling through inventory, their files updating long after they've left. I've tried to leave 3 times. Each time my belongings are returned to Locker C. Each time I'm readmitted. I don't know how to stop the cycle. I don't know if anyone else sees it. I think Rita might. I hope she doesn't end up in her own locker. I dropped the notebook. I checked the admissions log. Thomas Whitley had been readmitted the previous night. I went to the unit and asked to see him. He was in bed 7, sitting upright, staring at the wall. He looked exactly like the photograph from the locker. Older, grayer, worn. I said. He turned to look at me. His expression was weary but unsupported. He nodded slowly. That some of us don't leave. We just keep getting readmitted. The belongings stay in the locker, the files stay open, and the intake process repeats. I've been discharged 4 times. I didn't know what to say. Check your own locker, he said quietly. I returned to the property room. Locker A was assigned to long-term storage, reserved for items belonging to patients who'd been transferred or deceased. I unlocked it. Inside was a bag labeled with my name, Rita Callahan. I opened it. Inside was a ward clerk uniform, a name badge, a set of keys, and a notebook. I opened the notebook. The first entry was dated today. I thought I was processing other people's belongings. I thought I was the one managing the inventory, updating the logs, sealing the bags. I didn't realize I was already in the system. I didn't realize my belongings had been stored weeks ago, waiting for me to find them. I don't remember being admitted, but the intake form is here, signed in my handwriting, documenting items I don't remember surrendering. I checked the intake form inside the bag. It was signed by me. The date was August 1st, 6 weeks ago. I don't know when I became a patient. I don't know when I stopped being the clerk and started being part of the inventory. I don't know if I ever left the property room, or if I've been cataloging my own belongings, sealing my own bag, updating my own file, trapped in a cycle I didn't recognize until I read my name on the label. Some lockers never empty, some belongings never get returned, and some people discover too late that they've been processing their own intake forms, documenting their own admissions, locking their own possessions in lockers that refill every morning, waiting for a discharge that never comes, cycling through inventory logs that list their name over and over. Each entry identical, each bag sealed, each form signed, proving that they were here, that they've always been here, that they never really left. Story 8. Discharge Summary Voluntary Release. The discharge summary was complete. I read through it carefully. Treatment history, clinical course, medication reconciliation, follow-up plan, everything in order. Then I reached the final section, recommendations for continued care. It listed weekly therapy sessions with me, not a referral to another provider. Sessions with me scheduled through the end of the year. But I hadn't treated this patient. I'd written the discharge summary for someone I'd never met, documenting sessions I'd never conducted, recommending follow-up care I would provide for a case I didn't know existed. My name is Dr. Nathan Coyle, and I was the attending psychiatrist at Harrington Behavioral Health Unit for 19 years before my license was suspended pending review by the State Medical Board. I'm providing this statement as part of the board's investigation into allegations of fraudulent documentation, ghost billing, and unethical treatment planning. I understand that my account will be scrutinized and that my professional reputation depends on its credibility. I will describe the events exactly as they occurred, knowing that the explanation I offer is incomplete and insufficient. Discharge summaries are final documents. They synthesize the patient's entire hospital stay, from admission through treatment and release. They include diagnostic impressions, medication changes, therapeutic interventions, and a comprehensive plan for outpatient care. A discharge summary closes the case legally and clinically. It's the last word in a patient's inpatient record. I typically completed 2 or 3 discharge summaries per week, depending on patient turnover. The process was methodical. Review the medical record, summarize the clinical course, assess treatment outcomes, and provide clear aftercare recommendations. I signed each summary electronically and submitted it to medical records for archiving. On October 3rd, I arrived at my office and found a notification in my task queue. Discharge summary pending signature. I opened the document. It was labeled Discharge Summary Voluntary Release. Patient Jonathan Voss. I didn't recognize the name. I checked my active patient list. Jonathan Voss wasn't on it. I checked recently discharged patients. No record of him. I assumed it was an administrative error. Maybe the summary had been routed to me by mistake. But when I opened the document, it was written in my style. The phrasing, the clinical language, the structure. It was unmistakably my work. The summary detailed a 3-week admission for major depressive disorder. The patient had been admitted on September 10th following suicidal ideation. Treatment included antidepressant medication, individual therapy, and group sessions. The clinical course was unremarkable. Symptoms improved steadily. The patient was discharged on October 3rd today, with outpatient follow-up arranged. The summary was thorough, well-organized, and professionally written. It looked like every discharge summary I'd ever completed. Except I hadn't written it. I checked the electronic signature at the bottom of the document. My name, my credentials, my digital signature time-stamped at 6:43 a.m. that morning. I had not been in the office at 6:43 a.m. I'd arrived at 8:30. I searched the patient database for Jonathan Voss. No record, no admission note, no progress notes, no medication orders, no billing entries. He didn't exist in the system, but his discharge summary existed. I called medical records and asked if they had any information about Jonathan Voss. They searched the archives. No file, no previous admissions, no history. I contacted the nursing staff and asked if anyone remembered treating a patient named Jonathan Voss. No one did. I flagged the document as erroneous and moved it to a pending review folder. I assumed it was a test case or a template that had been accidentally submitted under my credentials. The next day, I found another discharge summary in my task queue. Discharge summary, voluntary release, patient Elaine Monroe. I opened it. Same format, same style, same electronic signature. The summary described a 10-day admission for anxiety and panic disorder. Treatment included cognitive behavioral therapy, relaxation training, and medication management. The patient was discharged with outpatient referrals. I didn't recognize the name. I checked the database. No record of Elaine Monroe, but the summary was written in my voice, signed with my credentials, submitted under my user ID. I searched the summary for specific details that might reveal its origin. The narrative mentioned individual therapy sessions conducted on specific dates. September 20th, September 23rd, September 27th. I checked my calendar. I had conducted therapy sessions on those dates, but with different patients. I reviewed my session notes for those days. None of them involved a patient named Elaine Monroe. Yet the discharge summary referenced those sessions as if I'd conducted them with her. I reported the issue to the medical director, Dr. Philip Gearhart. I explained that discharge summaries were appearing under my name for patients I'd never treated. I showed him both documents. He reviewed them carefully. "Nathan, these are your summaries." He checked the submission logs. Both summaries showed my user ID, my terminal, and my timestamp. He asked, "I don't see how." He suggested changing my credentials and monitoring for further irregularities. I agreed. I changed my password that afternoon. I logged out of all devices and ensured that only my primary workstation had access to my account. The next morning, there were 3 more discharge summaries in my task queue, all for patients I didn't recognize, all written in my style, all signed with my updated credentials. I read through each one. They described different admissions, different diagnoses, different treatment plans. But they all shared a common element. The follow-up recommendations listed continued outpatient therapy with me. Not referrals to external providers, not recommendations for community resources, specific appointments scheduled with me, with dates and times already blocked on my calendar. I checked my calendar. The appointments were there. Blocked for 1-hour sessions, labeled with patient names I didn't recognize. I deleted the appointments. I refused to sign the discharge summaries. The following day, the appointments reappeared on my calendar. The discharge summaries reappeared in my task queue, now marked as overdue, signature required. I called Dr. Gerhardt again. He came to my office and reviewed the documents with me. "Nathan," he said slowly, "these summaries are billing the insurance companies." I didn't have an answer. He pulled the billing records. Each discharge summary had triggered claims submitted to insurance companies. Claims for inpatient psychiatric care provided by me. The claims were being paid. "We're receiving reimbursement for treatment you say you didn't provide," Dr. Gerhardt said. The audit began the next week. Every discharge summary I'd completed over the past 12 months was reviewed by an external compliance team. They compared the summaries to patient records, billing entries, and my documented schedule. They found 47 discharge summaries for patients who had no corresponding medical records. 47 cases where I'd allegedly provided treatment, written summaries, and submitted billing claims for patients who didn't exist. The billing department confirmed that all 47 claims had been paid. The facility had received reimbursement totaling over $200,000 for services I had never rendered. I was placed on immediate leave. The medical board opened an investigation. The insurance companies initiated fraud audits. I tried to explain. I showed them the timestamps, the login discrepancies, the impossibility of treating patients who weren't admitted. But the summaries were too detailed, too consistent with my clinical style. They were written by someone who knew my methods, my diagnostic reasoning, my documentation habits. They were written by me, or by something that knew how I worked well enough to replicate it perfectly. During my suspension, I started receiving calls from patients. People I didn't recognize calling to confirm their follow-up appointments with me. They referenced therapy sessions we'd allegedly had. They thanked me for the progress they'd made during their inpatient stays. I told them there must be a mistake, that I hadn't treated them. They were confused. They insisted they remembered meeting with me, talking with me, working through their treatment plans under my care. One patient, a man who identified himself as Jonathan Voss, called to say he was struggling and wanted to schedule an emergency session. He said I'd told him during his discharge that he could reach out any time. "I've never met you," I said. "You discharged me on October 3rd, he said. "You wrote in my summary that I showed significant improvement." There was a long pause. "Dr. Subas." I ended the call. I pulled the discharge summary for Jonathan Voss and read it again. The recommendation section stated, "Patient demonstrates strong therapeutic alliance with Dr. Coyle. Continued weekly individual therapy recommended to maintain gains and prevent relapse. Patient has agreed to follow up and has Dr. Coyle's contact information." I had never met Jonathan Voss, but he remembered me. He remembered sessions I hadn't conducted, insights I hadn't shared, a therapeutic relationship I hadn't built. I don't know if I wrote those discharge summaries in a fugue state, during episodes of dissociation I can't recall. I don't know if someone replicated my credentials and created an elaborate fraud scheme. I don't know if the patients are real people who were treated by someone impersonating me, or if they're constructs that exist only in the documentation. Calling to confirm appointments that were never scheduled. What I know is this: some discharge summaries close cases that were never opened. Some treatment plans document care that was never provided. And some patients remember sessions that never occurred, carrying forward a therapeutic relationship with a clinician who doesn't remember meeting them, following recommendations written in summaries that shouldn't exist, attending follow-up appointments that fill a calendar the clinician never controlled. Discharge summaries are supposed to finalize care, but sometimes they initiate it. Sometimes they create cases retroactively, building narratives of treatment that span weeks, filling records with progress notes and billing codes, and binding the clinician to patients they never knew they were treating. I've stopped checking my task queue, but I still get calls, patients thanking me, patients asking for advice, patients who remember me with a clarity I can't match, describing moments we shared in sessions I don't recall, referencing insights I never offered, building their recovery on foundations I never laid. And somewhere, in a database I can no longer access, discharge summaries continue to appear under my name. Summaries for patients I haven't met, summaries documenting voluntary releases, successful treatment outcomes, and detailed follow-up plans. Recommending continued care with a psychiatrist who no longer practices, no longer signs, but whose voice still echoes in narratives he didn't write, closing cases that never end one summary at a time.